Hey guys, hi, welcome back once again. My name is Vaishali and today I'd like to talk about the concept of self. Know thyself. So what essentially do we mean when we say the self? Why is it so important to address the self? Why is it so important to know the self? And since we understand the world through the perception of the self, I think it becomes then important to even address the self and therein even address all of the concepts that are associated with the concept called as the self. I think it even becomes important to address the self because our relative identities gets associated with the concept of the self. And I'm not saying that the self is an absolute construct. It's a developmental construct. But I also think that there are some underlying baseline constructs or concepts or beliefs or mindsets or ideologies or philosophies that guide in the development of the concept called as the self. I also think it's equally important to understand the concept of the developed and the developing self, because it is only when we start understanding this self for our own selves can we start addressing all of the concepts related to the concept of the self itself. So before we begin addressing what the self actually entails, let us also try and figure out the certain concepts that are associated with the very idea, with the very ideology, with the very mindset of the self itself. So here are a few that I had written, and we can keep adding more and more and more onto our list. So some of the concepts associated with the self are self-love, self-acceptance, self-responsibility, self-accountability, self-imposed, self-implied, self-constructed, self-made, self-regulated, self-soothing, self-sufficient, self-abandonment, selfless, selfish, self-discipline, self-control, self-informed, self-compassion, self-inquiry, self-knowledge, self-awareness, self-realization, self-actualization. And we can add more and more and more and more onto the list of this concept called as the self. So what then is this self that we actually talk about when we even kind of address all of these concepts that are related to the concept of the self itself? So many concepts associated with the self. So what then is the self that everybody keeps talking about? Is it just a one-way street, or is it multi-layered, multi-dimensional? How is the self informed so that it can even conceptualize the idea of it being a self? Even before we begin deciphering the idea of the self, let us try and firstly understand that the self is constantly in exchange, constantly in communication, constantly in interaction with something or somebody or an idea that may be all pervasive in that particular culture, in that particular ideology, in that particular philosophy, and therein's the mindset. And in most ways than not, it is these cultural or philosophical ideologies, it is these cultural understandings, it is these cultural constructs, it is these cultural norms that helps us identify with certain ideologies, with certain mindsets that are more acceptable than the others, that are more pervasive than the others, that also helps us inform what the self is all about. And as of today and for the longest time, there are essentially two philosophies that the self identifies with, that the self gets informed with. And the two philosophies or the two ideologies or the two cultural mindsets essentially are V-centric, which is also called as the Eastern philosophy or the Eastern ideology or the Eastern mindset, and the other is the me-centric, which is also called as the Western ideology, the Western philosophy or the Western mindset. So if we consider the V philosophy or the Eastern philosophy or the Eastern ideology or the mindset, which is more V-centric, we'll understand that the self gets informed by as many associations with the other selves it has around it, which essentially means that it's like the house of cards. As many number of cards that you have, the better your self gets informed, the better your self gets formed, the better your self gets identified with, which then also tells us that the self gets identified with this deck of cards. It essentially doesn't have an autonomy of its own. It may then also have these many more number of social associations and therefore social obligations as well. Now, the obligations may not necessarily be all the time negative. They can be the biggest asset, but they also can be the biggest liability. And in such a scenario, it also happens that when one individual rises up, it gets applauded, but also the group gets applauded at the same time. The group may also rise at the same time. On the other hand, just like any domino effect, when one individual falls or when one individual falters, it may result in the entire house of cards falling apart. And therefore, if you can think of the movie, say Ram Leela, or for that matter, Two States, when two people decide to come in together, it's the entire family, it's the entire social system that marries or that comes together. In fact, in the movie Two States, it's also said that I'm not marrying one person, but I'm marrying the entire family. And maybe the entire community that gets extended with this family. Now, for some reason, if the bigger community is not in acceptance with the two individuals coming together, the two individuals have to compromise. They have to settle for something less that they essentially want for themselves. So maintaining some kind of a status quo or some kind of a compromised harmony becomes more imperative, becomes more essential. So in such a scenario, when we talk about self-love, when we talk about self-respect, when we talk about self-discipline, when we talk about self-control, when we talk about self-elation, we should also understand that the concept of self is not only this. The concept of self is essentially the deck of cards. So apart from the examples that were given with regards to how the self identifies with itself, we can also take some real life examples wherein all of these people decide to go into a restaurant for their meal. They all will not be able to have their say with regards to the meal that they want to have. It will be a collective decision of the few or the many. Also, it's equally important to acknowledge that not all of these people will get ready at the same time, and therefore punctuality also has a different connotation. However, in the me-centric philosophy, in the me-centric ideology, in the me-centric mindset, which is also called as the Western mindset, it is also important to understand that the me also functions along with we, but the way it functions with the aspect of the we is very different from the we-centric cultures. So in the cultures that are more me-centric, the me identifies with a few other me or a smaller aspect of the we, and there ends the social obligations, both in terms of they being a liability and an asset, also is far less. In the cultures that are more me-centric, every individual is personally responsible for their own selves and for their direct families. Their identities with regards to addressing the self does not get overextended, it doesn't get overstretched, it doesn't overexpand. So in such mindsets, when we relate it to the earlier examples, we can say that the two people who are wanting to marry, who are desiring to marry or get into a relationship with each other are essentially responsible for their own individual selves and towards each other. They may then not be essentially needing to marry the entire family and the entire community thereafter. So even when they decide to go into a restaurant, they might essentially have more autonomy to order their own meal individually. And the aspect of punctuality may also take a very different turn. However, we should also remember that if the person who's ordered a particular food doesn't like the food that they have ordered, it is their own individual responsibility. They are solely accountable for the food that they have ordered. And the third just might be wherein this person identifies solely with its own autonomous self. They are only accountable for their own self. And probably it's my understanding that these people are then sannyasis or somebody else like that. The question isn't which one is right or which one is wrong or which is better than the other. The inquiry should rather be more reflective. If we need to have any kind of self-awareness, if we need to have any kind of self-compassion, if we need to have any kind of self-control, if we need to have any kind of self-discipline, if we need to have any kind of self-autonomy, if we need to have any kind of self-empowerment, I think it then becomes essential to question, to inquire, to sit with our own selves, to constantly discover this concept of the self, which can be self-informative, which can also be self-informative in this way, which can also be self-informing in this way, through this way as well. And however we choose to identify with the self, we should always bear in mind that the self is also very interactive. And all of the self-related concepts are equally interactive. What do they inform and how do they inform the self is also another aspect that one should reflect on when one is talking about identifying or knowing thyself. Let's try and think a little more about that, and I will see you once again the next week. Till then, stay tuned in. And guys, if you do like the contents of my videos, please do like, share and subscribe.